started. It's a pleasure to have now Alessandro Pavan speaking about differential taxation and occupational choice. 40 minutes, Alessandro, and then Vitor Farinha will discuss.
Okay. While we wait for the slides, so let me take the opportunity to thank the organizers. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. So this is joint work with Renato Gomez and Jean-Marie Lotz-Moore, both from Toulouse. So it's a project about taxation, and for those of you who were in São Paulo last week, so it shares with the work that I've presented on Saturday, the idea that the taxation is largely driven by redistribution considerations in a world with asymmetric information, but then the two angles are completely different. In the paper that I presented on Saturday, I was looking at the dynamics. Here I'm considering a completely static problem, but where productivity is multidimensional and is sector specific. So when you design a tax code, you take into account not just how you're going to affect the supply of labor, but also how you induce agents to sort themselves over different occupations. So that's the key distinction between the two papers. So in taxation theory, there are two fundamental results that shape the intellectual debate on how to structure optimally the tax code. So one is the Diamond and Merlis theorem, and the other is the Atkinson and Stiglitz theorem. So the Diamond and Merlis theorem establish the optimality of production efficiency. So essentially it establishes that if a government has a rich set of instruments, so if you're not exogenously constrained in your way of designing the code, then you may distort labor supply, you may distort, of course, consumption, but you should not mess it up when it comes to production efficiency. What does that mean? It means that for a given amount of inputs, there should not be a reallocation of inputs across sectors, for example, that permits you to produce more. The other key result in taxation theory goes under the name of Atkinson and Stiglitz, which establishes that if you have sophisticated income taxes, and if preferences are separable in the utility of consumption and disutility of labor, which is the canonical assumption which is made not just in taxation but also managerial compensation theory, then you should not use sale taxes. Well, so why do you care? So why do you care about each of these two results? A lot, because the combination of the two provides an intellectual ground to justify, for example, for opposing taxation of intermediate goods, but also for opposing, to a large extent, capital taxation, but also opposing differential sale taxes and sector-specific income tax deductions. So there's a very intense political debate on how to structure taxes, and in particular how to structure not just income taxes, but the combination between income, sales, and capital taxes. And these two theorems are the cornerstone for opening up the debate about how to structure things. And as you can imagine, they are highly influential, not just among academics, but also about policymakers for good or bad reasons. So what we do in this paper is we consider what in our eyes is the national enrichment of the intellectual debate that takes into account that agents differ in the productivity in a sector-specific manner. So if you ask me, how costly it is for me to generate income by being an economist, and you compare that to how costly it would be to generate the same income by, doing snowboarding, probably would be lower to do snowboarding, but I made a mistake and I became an economist. But the important thing is, that people are really different in the ability to generate income across sectors, and when you take that into account, then actually what we show is that actually both theorems turn out to be overturned. So we establish the failure of the Diamond-Merlis theorem, showing that actually production inefficiency is a robust and generic property of optimal tax codes, and that will define genericity in an appropriate manner. We also establish a failure of the Atkinson-Stiglitz theorem, showing that if for political considerations, it's impossible to levy income taxes in a sector-specific manner. Suppose that the government doesn't permit you to do so. You cannot tax engineers differently from the way you tax, income generating in other sectors. Then actually, input tax, commodity or input taxes become optimal. So the redundancy of sale taxes disappear. From a theoretical standpoint, the contribution here is in developing a new methodology for solving multidimensional screening problems with a combination of intensive and extensive margin. So the literature is a bit, too broad for me to go into details. Here I'm just focusing on the debate about taxation in connection to occupational choice. NATO was the first one to show that actually production efficiency may be desirable if you have occupational choice, but he considered a case where occupational choice is not really a choice variable, in the sense that either you're skilled or you're unskilled, and you can just switch from one to the other. And then following up, showed that actually if you look at the long run and if people can decide whether to become skilled or unskilled, then production efficiency is restored. The closest to our work is a work by Rothschild and Schur. They consider a ROI model similar to ours, but they impose uniform taxation. They don't permit the government, either directly or indirectly through sales taxes, to essentially manipulate the way agents allocate across sectors. And by implication, of course, they obtain production efficiency. Okay, so let me move on because time is limited. So I'm going to set up the model, then establish some preliminaries about characterization of incentive-compatible allocations for this multidimensional screening problem, characterize the optimal tax code in an environment where the government permits you to use income-specific, sector-specific income taxes, and then impose what I think of as a political economy restriction that says that suppose that actually you cannot tax income in a differentiated manner depending on the sector, and then I show how you can play with sales taxes and do better than what you could have done by forcing yourself to production efficiency. And then I will conclude. So here's the model. So the economy is populated by a unit mass continuum of agents, and there are two sectors, A and B. The productivity of an agent in sector J is given by Nj. That's an element of an interval, a possibly unbounded interval, so as to accommodate some of the distribution that people want to work with in public economics. And the agent type is the collection of his productivity in each of the two sectors. Okay? Types are drawn in an ID manner from a distribution F with a support N. I'm going to rule out mass points, so F is absolute continuous with respect to the Lebesgue measure. Fj would be the marginal with respect to the J dimension. Fj given K, the conditional. So agents with productivity Nj supplying Hj hours in sector J generates Nj times Hj of effective labor. So this is again, it's a jargon imported from PF. What differentiates effective labor from income is that income is obtained by the amount of effective labor that you produce times the wage rate that you get. So think of Hj is the number of hours that Muhamet works per day, Nj is his productivity, the product of the two is the number of firms he proves per day, and omega j is how much MIT pays per theorem. Okay? So that's his per day income. So the tax system comprises two functions and two scalars. The functions Tj describes how much income is taxed in sector J. And no restrictions are imposed, so it could be non-linear, it could have all sorts of possible discontinuities, kink points, and you name it. Tau J, these are the sales tax on good J. Okay, so that's the component of the tax code that is linear and which comes from the sales of the good as opposed to the income itself. If you were to impose uniform income taxation, that would correspond to say that this function TA has to be the same across the two sectors. So you cannot tax income generated in Silicon Valley in a way that is different from the income which is generated in Wall Street, as long as is labor income. Of course, you can always tax capital gains in a different manner. Another application of this model, but the one that presumably I won't have time to talk about today, is one where one sector could be informal, which boils down to essentially saying that you can't raise income taxes in that sector. This is a black market. So there's no way you can go there and ask people to pay income taxes. However, if you think that this black market in southern Italy, presumably it has a lot to do with the production of a particular good, then what you could do is try to affect the entire functioning of the economy by using sale taxes on that particular good. So that's another application of this methodology. So there could be political economy constraints that prevent you from raising income taxes in one particular sector. And then the question is, how do you set up the income tax in the sector that you can tax, and how you bundle that with the appropriate sales taxes in order to do the best that you can. So let me now talk about payoffs. An agent with type N who decides to supply HJ hours in sector J gets a payoff which is equal to his income, net of how much taxes he pays, net of the disutility of working. Okay, so that's the usual assumption that says that utility of money, of compensation, of consumption is separable in the disutility of working. For certain results, I will conveniently assume that the disutility of effort is isoelastic. That's the typical assumption made in this literature. I'm going to assume that the production side is described by what I did a moment ago. On the demand side, there's a classical firm with linear technologies, and for convenience here I'm just dropping capital. There's nothing going on of interest from the capital side. So just think of the amount of output produced as being equal to the amount of labor which is employed by the firm. So the firm profits is equal to the revenue that it makes minus how much you pay to the workers minus how much sales taxes you pay. So the reason for assuming a neoclassical firm with constant return to scale is by design is precisely to isolate the new effects that come from the fact that agents here sort themselves out across the two sectors instead of using other theory of possible optimality of occupational choice distortions that could come, for example, from spillovers between the two sectors, or the fact that you may, as a government, dislike a law to one sector rather than the other one. We want to shut that down completely in order to give us the highest possible chances of maintaining the Atkinson, Stiglitz, and the Diamond-Merlis theorems, and essentially overturn these two key results in public economics entirely by the symmetry of information. So an allocation here is specified as a collection of two functions. One is an occupational choice rule that describes how agents sort themselves over Silicon Valley and Wall Street as a function of their productivities, and then functions that specify how much they work once they join each of the two sectors. So I'm going to say that an allocation is implementable at the wage rates W if I can construct a tax code that does the job. What does it mean that it does the job? Well, it means that it satisfies the following four properties. The first one is a consistency property that says that the level of productivities present in sector A, this is the domain of the labor supply function in sector A, coincides with a set of productivities for which I can find an NB, a level of productivity in the other sector, such that an agent with this pair of productivity indeed ends up working in sector A. The second is an intensive margin incentive compatibility constraint that says that the equilibrium payoff of someone with productivity NJ who decides to join sector J coincides with the value function, the maximum the agent could do by optimally choosing how much labor to supply. The third one is an extensive margin constraint that says that if you join sector J, it's because it's optimal for you to do so. So the max you can obtain, given your bidimensional type by working sector J, is higher than what you can obtain by picking the other sector. And the last one is a production incentive compatibility constraint that says that the amount of labor employed by the firm is optimal from the perspective of the firm. So taxation equilibrium consists of an allocation along with the taxes and wages, such that the allocation is implementable at the given wages by the tax system, and the tax system satisfies some budget constraint, whatever that is. So the budget constraint simply says that the amount of money that you raised through income taxes and through sales taxes has to exceed some threshold. And the threshold for me comes out of the blue. That's what the government dictates. That's what I have to collect. It could be determined in a general equilibrium model by other considerations, including the ability to raise debt by the government. This is, of course, it's beyond the scope of analysis. Okay, so what's the planner's problem? Planner problems consist in finding a tax system that maximizes certain welfare function. So think of the indirect utility of an agent with multidimensional type n as the max the agent can obtain by choosing optimally which sector to join. And then tilde takes into account that once you choose a sector, you also optimally decide how much labor to supply. When the planner chooses an equilibrium in order to maximize either a Rawlsian objective, which consists in essentially giving all the weight to the agent with the lowest productivity, or some concave utilitarian welfare function where you're weighting different utilities, or equivalently different agents, with different weights. These weights could be linear, could be non-linear, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so let's start by identifying what the government could do in this economy. So I'm going to say that an allocation is implemented at wages W by the tax system tau if and only if the following two conditions hold. So this is an initial characterization of incentive compatibility. It better be the case that for each sector, incomes are non-decreasing. It's the usual monotonicity condition when applied to this environment. And payoffs have to satisfy this property. So the indirect utility of the agent has to be Lipschitz continuous. So that's it's not imposed, it's a requirement of incentive compatibility. And the speed by which your payoff changes with your type has to be related to your labor supply. And that's exactly the rate that links the two. The second property of incentive compatibility is the one that pertains to the extensive margin. There must exist an absolute continuous or weakly increasing threshold function with the property that if this is your multidimensional type, you join sector A if your productivity in sector B is low enough. That's obvious. So the only thing that is not obvious is why the function has to be continuous and weakly increasing, or actually even that should be obvious. But yeah. Over what? Which you can, but the government will never gain by inducing you to do it. At most, there could be a countable set of types for which the government could create indifference, but then this randomization will not impact welfare, under the assumption that there are no mass points. So here's the representation. So that's the threshold rule. Everyone whose productivity is in this region joins sector A. Everyone who's in this region joins sector B. What is production efficiency? The 45-degree line. So Diamond Merlis will say that if your productivity is higher in Silicon Valley than in Wall Street, you should go to Silicon Valley. Okay, now the next observation is that once I take into account that occupational choice has to satisfy the optimality condition dictated by incentive compatibility, then I should also observe that the labor supply in one sector is really redundant. What is redundant is that it's not really control. Once I determine how I want to sort agents across the two sectors, that's my C choice, and once I pick the labor supply in sector A, then the labor supply in sector B is automatically determined by the other two policies. So de facto I have only two policies to play with. Okay. So the next thing to do is to construct the endogenous measure that corresponds to the distribution of productivities across the two sectors. And that's one of the key distinctions of this paper with respect to previous work, including, for example, Schur and Rothschild. So here people remember that when you choose a tax equilibrium, you're also endogenously allocating productivities over the two sectors. So I'm going to denote by GA as the measure of agents whose productivity is less than NA, induced by my occupational choice rule C. Something similar for sector B, but then I will conveniently work with this transformation. This is a joint measure that tells me what is the measure of agents working in sector A with productivity less than an A, plus the measure of agents working in sector B with productivity is less than C of an A. Remember that the C is the cutoff, is what determines how people allocate themselves between the two sectors. So essentially this is a trick, it's an auxiliary measure that permits me to turn a multidimensional problem into a unidimensional one. So the picture here is meant just to give you a sense of, this is not the representation of a measure, of course. It's just, where the measure essentially have a byte, who I'm describing. So G of an A over C is the measure of agents working in sector A whose productivity is at most equal to NA. Okay, so the corresponding density will correspond to the density illustrating this segment. Likewise for sector B. And then this fictitious auxiliary measure is what to describe whoever is working in each of the two sectors with productivity less than an A in one sector and C of an A in the other sector. That corresponds to the measure that you assign to this rectangle. So when I will move NA, take into account the occupational choice C, de facto will move the measure of people who allocate themselves over both sectors. So that's a way of essentially turning two measures into a single one. So how do you solve now for the optimal equilibrium? So the typical approach is that you take a nuclear bomb, you put it on a rocket, you shoot on the mosquitoes, and you declare mission accomplished. Okay, so that's optimal control. So the other approach that you can follow, ultimately has to be consistent with the former, is to identify appropriate perturbations of whatever you claim to be optimal, but don't improve upon what you're proposing to be optimal, and nonetheless they permit you to identify the key economic properties of interest. So I'm going to follow the latter approach, but of course I'm not really cheating, so what I claim to be a variational approach that vindicates my properties as being consistent with optimality can also be established with a nuclear bomb. So if you prefer a nuclear bomb, you can always set it up. So the characterization procedure here, and with some methodological contribution that I'm attached to, although who cares, so maybe actually I'm the only one attached to, is to set up a primal dual approach that really permits you to identify what we care in terms of key economic properties. So the primal approach takes the occupational choice rule as given. So suppose that I don't have any control on the occupational choice rule. When I say that, I don't mean that I can control how agents allocate themselves over the two sectors. So it has to be the case that whatever I do by setting up my tax code respects this occupational choice as an equilibrium outcome. So remember that I cannot force people to work in Wall Street or in Silicon Valley. People do allocate themselves based on what is good for them. But then what I do is I look at a taxation equilibrium that does the best for me, so maximize my objective, subject to the constraint that the government asks me to implement this particular occupational choice rule. So notice that this primal problem could also be of interest to you if, for example, for political consideration, you want to favor one sector over the other. Okay? Suppose that the government dictates that it better be the case that the measure of people working in Wall Street is not too high. So according to whatever restriction it could justify that imposition. Then the primal could still be useful for you for that. The dual takes as given labor supply in one of the two sectors, let's say sector A. And then it derives the best taxation equilibrium under the constraint that whoever works in sector A supplies labor according to what is specified by this function. But for example, one of the objectives of the dual is to determine how people allocate themselves over the two sectors. Everything, of course, has to be consistent with a taxation equilibrium. And remember, a taxation equilibrium, in its definition, has both incentive compatibility, but also the budget constraint that the government may impose on you as a designer. An optimal taxation equilibrium has to solve both the primal and the dual. So the policies of the labor supply and the tax policies that constitute an optimal equilibrium have to solve the primal, and the occupational choice and the other labor supply in the remaining sector, together with the tax system, have to solve the dual. So this is an obvious observation that it says that whenever you have more than one control, you can always look at the joint optimality by decompose it into primal and the dual. There's nothing really particular in what I'm saying. It's just the way now we'll solve the two problems by invoking the appropriate perturbations is what will permit me to identify the right economic properties. So, because I'm going to talk about Diamond and Merlis, I have to define what I mean by production efficiency for this economy. An equilibrium exhibits production efficiency if and only if, holding fixed labor supply of each worker, there exists no reallocation of workers across sectors that yields higher aggregate output. And that, of course, is consistent with incentive compatibility. So that's what it means to have production efficiency. There's no way you can just reallocate inputs across sectors and increase total output. Okay, so the first observation, how am I doing on time?
16 minutes.
16. Okay. So the first observation is that if a government doesn't impose political economy constraints on me, then I can forget about sales taxes. No, I already have enough instruments in the non-linear design of income taxes that what do I gain with sales taxes? So the first observation is that it starts with any equilibrium that has sales taxes. I can construct another tax system where sales taxes are equal to 0, wages are equal to 1, and I do everything that I need to do directly with income taxes. Now let me tackle the primal problem. So by tackling the primal problem, essentially what I uncover is the generalization of Merlis to a multidimensional sector economy. So the generalization of Merlis says that when you look at marginal taxes across sectors, they have to satisfy this optimality condition. So what this optimality condition is saying is, in essence, that you're trading off two things. You're trading off the fact that if you were to raise taxes in one sector, you would get a direct benefit of being able to collect more resources from the sector, which you could then use, if you're Rawlsian, for example, to transferring these resources to the guy who's the poorest in society. If you're not Rawlsian, then this direct benefit of increasing on the margin taxes at a certain level of income level should also take into account that if you raise taxes, you're going to make everyone whose productivity is higher than the cutoff where you're raising taxes. And how much you care about the utility of these agents is what is determined by this indicator function ICU. So that's the benefit of taxes. Why do you tax? Well, because you want to collect resources. What are the two costs that you have to take into account at the margin? Is that people are smart. When you tax them, when you change the tax code, they change the labor supply. Now the contribution here is in relating exactly the elasticity effect of labor supply in one sector to the elasticity of labor supply in the other sector once you constrain yourself to a particular occupational choice rule. So you give me the occupational choice rule. Optimality requires that for each level of income generated in sector A and the corresponding level of income generated by sector B by someone who's just indifferent between joining sector A and joining sector B, well, the elasticity effect across the two sectors have to combine according to this optimality condition. So here's the graphical illustration of who's affected by the direct effect and the elasticity effects. Take an agent with productivity NA and whose productivity in sector A and whose productivity in sector B is C of NA. This is someone who's just indifferent between going to one sector or the other. Suppose that you were to raise a little bit the marginal tax that you apply to the income level corresponding to this guy. Well, of course, if you increase the income level, the tax that you apply to this guy, then you change the amount of labor supply that this guy is going to provide. And of course, in order to implement the same occupational choice, remember that in the primal problem, occupational choice is dictated to you by the government. You have no control over it. Then you should change the tax code also in the other sector in order to take into account the variation in the supply of labor by the guy in the other sector. So these two areas essentially correspond to people who are affected by the elasticity effects. People that belong to this other area are people who are affected by the direct effect. If you raise taxes at this income level, then for someone like Umberto, who's much more productive, he's not going to change his labor supply. Nothing at the margin changes from his viewpoint. However, he's going to be worse off, because if you raise the marginal tax here, you also raise the total tax that he's going to pay. So everyone here is directly affected by the variation in the tax code. And if you were to take someone whose productivity is above Umberto's level, this is someone who is extremely productive in Silicon Valley. This is a very good entrepreneur, very poorly productive as a trader. He doesn't get any utility by looking at the numbers all the day. So this is someone who works in sector A, no matter what his productivity in sector B. So for someone here, there is no extensive margin consideration. So not surprisingly, you're back to Merlis. That's exactly Merlis' formula. It's an awful formula, but that's what it is. It simply tells you that the elasticity effect should be matched to the direct effect. Benefits should equal cost. Now, one nice observation is that in a model with occupational choices, and that's a key distinction with respect to Merlis, it's not the one that I emphasized at the beginning though, marginal tax rates could be negative. You could have subsidies at certain income levels. That cannot be in Merlis. If you really wanted to convince people not to go to Wall Street, it might be the case that your occupational choice rule that you want to implement is so much demanding that the only way you can induce people to go to Silicon Valley, if you think that that's desirable, is to essentially subsidize people in Silicon Valley. And this is just an example you can apply to your sector of preferred choice. So you could have negative marginal tax rates at certain occupational choice levels. Okay, now I wanted to solve the dual, and that's where the excitement comes from, for me at least. So the primal you could also have established it with a nuclear bomb. The dual, it's where it requires a little bit of more of creativity. So the way we're going to arrive to the, what in the jargon of optimal control theory is called an Euler condition, is by identifying a classes of reforms that we call alpha payroll tax reform. What is an alpha payroll tax reform? It's a reform of a tax system that is very simple. It says that if you take people working in sector B and take any income below a certain cutoff, pick whatever cutoff you want, then an alpha payroll tax reform works as follows. Under the reform, how much someone is going to pay, it's equal to a fixed percentage alpha, like 20% of your income, plus on the remaining 80% of your income, you're going to be taxed exactly as you were taxed before the reform. So very simple, actually. This is something you can even explain it to people in Washington. Okay? So the nice observation here is what happens when you implement an alpha payroll tax reform. And for something to be optimal, it must be the case that there is no one from Washington who can envision an alpha payroll tax reform that does better compared to whatever you're proposing to be optimal. So the nice observation is the following. Take someone who's affected by the reform. In other words, someone whose income is below the cutoff for which the reform applies. Well, look at what's the utility of his agent when he provides a certain number of hours of labor. How much he gets, it's exactly how much a friend of his with productivity 1 minus alpha of his own productivity would have obtained before the reform. So that means that how much of this guy is going to work after the reform is implemented, it's equal to the amount of labor that would have been supplied by his friend before the reform. His friend is someone whose productivity is 1 minus alpha, his own productivity. And likewise, his utility after the reform, it's equal to the utility of his friend before the reform. But that means that the relationship that is established in difference once the reform is implemented is that the rule, the occupational choice rule, is just 1 over 1 minus alpha, the old occupational choice rule. So let's now investigate as economists. I suppose I have no clue of optimal control. Actually, unfortunately, my kindergarten teacher taught me a little bit about mechanical design, but nothing about optimal control. So let's try to think about in economics what can happen if I implement an alpha payroll tax reform. The first thing that I ask myself is, in terms of utility, how do things change? Well, because I just identify the relevant equivalence between payoffs after the reform and payoffs before the reform. Now I ask myself, what happens if I change alpha and evaluate everything at alpha equal to 0? That's in the language of variational arguments, optimal control. That's what it means to envision a perturbation starting from something which is deemed to be optimal. Well, the marginal impact on someone whose productivity is NB is just proportional to how much before the reform his payoff was varying with his type times his productivity. But how much his payoff was changing with his type is what is determined by incentive compatibility. There was no, it itself was pinned down by the labor supply and by the regional tax code. Now I take into account that if I implemented the alpha reform, everyone whose productivity is below C of an A is going to be affected. So what's the total effect on welfare of implementing the reform? Well, that's exactly what I have here. But now I say, well, wait a minute, welfare is not the only thing, right? So you also care about the taxes. So now a thing to take into account is that this is how much revenue I obtain from the reform. Well, now let me investigate what is the marginal impact on revenue of implementing the reform starting from no reform, alpha equal to 0. And then I define, again, I integrate over everyone who's affected, and that's what I call my revenue collection effect. Revenue collection effect, it takes into account that if I implemented the reform, I change the amount of money that I bring to Washington. What's the third effect? Well, migration. Now that I implemented the reform, some people move from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Why do I care about the migration? Well, because when people move, the amount of taxes that I collect changes. Again, you can use this fictitious measure that I was describing in the beginning to compute exactly what is the migration effect. And the last effect, it's really the boring one. It's the fact I have to deal with incentive compatibility, unfortunately. Incentive compatibility doesn't permit me to have any discontinuity in payoffs. So that cannot be. So there's a continuity correction that has to come from the fact that, payoff of someone who is just before the cutoff where the reform applies has to have a payoff equal to someone who is just above the cutoff for which the reform applies. So that requires introducing a lump sum to compensate for the alpha payroll reform and preserve incentive compatibility. Global, they're all part of analysis, but all of this actually you can establish by looking at only at the necessary condition. Because any system, you're the challenger, I'm the defender. So I propose a tax system that is incentive compatible and generates a certain welfare. Now you're the challenger, so you come and you say, look, I do the alpha. So the alpha preserves incentive compatibility. The alpha payroll tax reform combined with this correction preserve global incentive compatibility. So for me to be able to defend myself, it better be the case that, you cannot do better. Okay, and now here's the Euler condition. That's it. So that's what you would have established with a nuclear bomb. Welfare effect has to be equal to revenue collection effect plus migration effect and the lump sum which is needed for preserving incentive compatibility. Continuity correction effect. That's exactly what optimality requires. So for something to be optimal, it has to be the case that the properties of the marginal taxes encoded into the tax system have to satisfy this condition. That's it. It depends what you want to get out of it. For what I want to get out of it, that's enough. So this is an optimality condition. Yeah, but typically as it is the case with variational arguments, there are many optimality conditions you can envision. I wanted to do two things. I want to establish that Diamond-Merlis doesn't hold for this environment in a generic sense. So just take and that's enough. Yeah. No, that's enough. Okay, so let me skip this picture. Now let me call, now I want to talk about Diamond-Merlis, and that I will use it the last 2 minutes and then I will conclude. I'm going to say that a distribution of productivity is non-generic if exists a scalar delta such that this condition holds. For each n in one sector, the density of people in that sector with this productivity times the conditional distribution of people who have a productivity less than n starting from n in that sector, it's just a scaling delta of what happens in the other sector. So symmetric distribution is non-generic. This defines a particular form of symmetry, which is definitely non-generic. So everything that satisfies this property is really non-generic. So take a taxation equilibrium. If the distribution is generic, then necessarily production efficiency fails. So unless you are in a knife edge case where everything is symmetric across the two sectors in the sense that I gave a moment ago, if not, then you will have a positive Lebesgue measure subset of types. Actually, this is a bad way of saying it. It's a positive measure set of types, but of course you can go from one to the other, for which excuse me, I misspoke. Actually, it's the right condition. You have a positive Lebesgue measure set of types for which the cutoff is different from the one induced by the 45-degree line. So when you translate it in economic properties, this means that there is a positive measure set of individuals who are induced to join the sector in which they are less productive. It would be more productive to work in Wall Street, but the government with a tax code induced them to go to Silicon Valley. So remember the Diamond-Merlis theorem says that assume the government can levy differentiated taxes on all input and outputs. This is satisfied in our environment. Then production efficiency obtains. So what's the key assumption of it permits us to overturn Diamond-Merlis? Asymmetric information combined with occupational choice. And both assumptions seem fairly reasonable when it comes to the design of tax codes. How many minutes do I have? 0. 1. So let me use the 60 seconds at my disposal just to talk about what happens if now the government is not so permissive. And the government says, you know what? There's no way I can convince Congress to tax income in two different sectors in different ways. So fine. Then I'm going to do the following. I'm going to now reintroduce sales taxes. Of course, sales taxes being linear, I won't be able to do exactly the same that I could have done if I could have levied sector-specific income taxes. So there's going to be a constraint on me now. And actually the particular constraint is that now the only type of occupational choice rule that I can implement with sales taxes are linear cutoff rules. And in general I may prefer to do non-linear stuff. This is not linear taxes, this is linear occupational choice rules. But then I can still do something similar to what I did in the general case, except that now I constrain myself to linear rules. But linear rules are always implementable with alpha payroll tax reforms. So all this machinery of the alpha payroll tax reforms, I can still apply it to the case where the government constrains me to use uniform income taxes. And then, what I establish is again that at the optimum, I will induce, for a positive measure set of individuals, I will induce them to join the sector in which the productivity is not the highest. But in so doing, indirectly, I also establish failure of the Atkinson-Stiglitz theorem. This theorem says that whenever utility of consumption is separable from this utility of labor, no reason to use sales taxes. Well, here I show the opposite, is that sales taxes are strictly needed if I want to distort occupational choices. In essence, why do I want to distort occupational choices? Well, because that's what permits me to economize on redistribution. Starting from a benchmark of efficiency in occupational choices, if I distort a little bit the way people allocate themselves over the two sectors, I incur only a second-order loss in terms of occupational efficiency, but a first-order gain in terms of the cost of redistribution. I make my life much easier when it comes to providing incentives to the agents to reveal the productivity in each of the two sectors. So the conclusions is, what we did here, we provide a general treatment of differential taxation together with occupational choice. If you're a little bit nerdish, you may have appreciated, the absence of nuclear bombs. That's the primal dual approach. It uncovers this generalized Merlis formula that has the economic property of indicating that if you really want to induce people to stop going to Wall Street, you may actually need to use the subsidies on the other sector. The Euler equation that we identify is obtained with these alpha payroll tax reforms that I think have its own beauty inside. and it uncovers the presence of these effects as the drivers of optimality. Migration effect, welfare effect, revenue collection, and continuity effects. The theorems that we establish show that Diamond-Mirrlees and Atkinson-Stiglitz need not hold if you have economies with asymmetric information and occupational choices. And I really want to finish by saying that this approach that we develop in this paper could also be applied to other multidimensional screening problems. What makes the analysis different from the one in Rocher or in Armstrong is that here you cannot hold the two professions at the same time. You really have to choose. Either you go to Wall Street or to Silicon Valley. So when it comes, for example, to monopolistic screening problems, there are environments where you cannot buy two homes. You have to buy only one. You don't have money for two homes at the same time. But you do have private information on how much you value an apartment relative to a single family house. So the techniques we develop in this paper also apply to other problems in screening with multidimensional types, but where you combine an intensive margin, in this model was labor supply, with an extensive margin, which is the choice of which occupation. In Musa-Rosen, the intensive margin would be how much quantity you buy. The extensive margin is what type of product you select to start with. So the techniques developed in this model could also be applied to this more general multidimensional screening with rivalry goods. Actually, I have one more slide.
Hello, thank you all for being here. I would like to thank Vinicius and Umberto for organizing this great workshop. And I would like to thank Alessandro for writing such an interesting paper for me to read. Discussing this paper, I thought it would be nice to go over a couple of simplifying and almost trivial examples that helped me understanding the driving forces behind the main results of the paper and suggested a couple of questions that I'd like to see the answers to. Quick summary. So in this paper, they consider the problem of optimal taxation in a two-sector ROI model. And agents are privately informed about their productivities in both sectors. So we have a two-dimensional mechanism design problem. And the main results in the paper are, first, that we have a failure of the Diamond-Mirrlees theorem that states that in the optimal tax system, we should leave production undistorted. So in this simplifying model, undistorted production means that labor should be allocated to the task in which it's most productive. And they show that this is not necessarily optimal. Second, we have a failure of the Atkinson-Stiglitz theorem that says that sales taxes are useless in the presence of rich enough income taxes. And they show that under the realistic assumption that we cannot contingent income taxes on the sector choices of agents, we can optimally use sales taxes. So let me start with the first example. What I'm doing in the first example is I'm shutting down private information in one of the sectors. So in sector A, agents are privately informed about their productivity just in the regional model, while in sector B, everyone has the same productivity and B. So there's no private information in sector B. So in this case, the job allocation rule, the sector allocation rule, is going to be described purely by a threshold. This threshold defines how productive you are in sector A, so that you end up going to that sector. And so the question is, what is the optimal choice of taxes and the threshold function? And I'm assuming without loss that we don't use sales taxes in this example. Okay. First, there will be no distortion in sector B because there's no private information in sector B. In sector A, we're going to have underproduction for the usual reasons understood from the taxation literature a long time ago, that by increasing the labor from a worker that has productivity in the middle of the distribution, I need to make everyone more productive than him happier, and this is bad for redistribution. I forgot to mention I'm considering the Rawlsian problem throughout the presentation. And finally, the optimal threshold is going to satisfy this first order condition that describes the marginal benefit from increasing the threshold a little bit. If I increase the threshold a little bit, I'm going to be pushing agents towards sector B that has no private information. So I'm going to gain the surplus that's produced in sector B, but I'm going to be losing the surplus that is produced in sector A at the threshold level. If we start from the efficient threshold, this first difference is going to be positive because we have efficient level of production in sector B, while we have underproduction in sector A. We have also an extra positive effect from pushing agents towards sector B in which there is no private information. This is due to the fact that in sector A, what we're doing is we're removing the bottom of the distribution of productivities. This allows us to extract more rents from the productive agents in sector A, which is good for redistribution. So the consequence of this is that the optimal threshold is going to be strictly higher than NB, which would be the full information threshold or the no distortion threshold in this simple model. So this example taught me is that allocating jobs in sector A is bad for two reasons. First, because production is inefficient in sector A, and second, because sector A has information rents due to private information, so this hurts redistribution. I think what is nice about this very simple example is that it not only tells me that production efficiency is not optimal, but it also tells me in what direction things are going to be distorted. So I think it would be nice to have a discussion in the paper of what are the properties of the distribution over productivity levels for a sector that would imply that that sector has a lower participation rate compared to the no distortion case. I think this could be done at least in the independent types case. That seems feasible. The first conjecture that came to my mind by looking at this example is that maybe looking at distributions that are ordered in terms of the hazard rate condition, we would be able to say something, but this is a very naive conjecture because even in the no distortion case, the relevant distribution accounts for the fact that agents end up in the sector in which they're most productive. So looking at this updated distribution sounds like a promising direction. I leave this as an open question for the authors, specifically for Alessandro. The second example. In the second example, what I'm doing is I'm shutting down the sector choice of the agents. So the population is separated between agents that work in sector A and they're privately informed about their productivity in sector A, and sector B, and they're privately informed about the productivity in that sector as well, but they cannot choose where to go. And F bar is going to be the average distribution over productivities without conditioning on the specific sector. So in this example, I'm talking about sales taxes. So I'm going to assume that the tax authority cannot use sector contingent income taxes, so it's going to use one uniform income tax for both sectors, but we have access to sales taxes. And notice that the important feature here is that the only way to design a tax system that's going to discriminate both sectors is by using sales taxes. So what is the optimal in this case, looking at from the Roland perspective as well? So first, let's call H bar and T bar the optimal allocation when we restrict sales taxes to be zero. This is going to be the standard optimal allocation in the Yildizian model, looking at the average distribution in the population. So zero sales taxes are going to be optimal whenever this equation is true. What this equation says is that the marginal revenue from creating sales taxes in sector A has to be equal to the marginal revenue from increasing sales taxes in sector B. So the first term is taken into account the fact that by increasing sales taxes, I'm going to appropriate a larger share of the average production. And the second term takes into account the behavioral responses of the agents, and I should say here the epsilons, the elasticity of labor to the productivity level. So the integrand here everything is calculated relative to the optimal for the average distribution in the population. So I'm being very informal here, but it's going to be rarely the case that for arbitrary distributions FA and FB, this equation is going to be true. So in general, we're going to have the optimality of the use of sales taxes. In the paper, there is a very similar equation that is equivalent to the optimality of zero sales taxes. However, it's changed by looking at a different distribution that takes into account the fact that agents choose to go to the sector in which they're most productive, in the no distortion case. This doesn't mean that, so the result in this paper without sector choice doesn't mean that sector choice is irrelevant, but it does mean that in order to separate the effect of purely targeting income taxes to the distribution in each sector and the extra effect of the sectoral choice that is endogenous, we have to look at the actual level of the optimal sales taxes rather than just talking about the optimality of non-zero sales taxes. So just to summarize, I think this is a very extremely interesting paper that revisits two of the most important results in taxation theory. My main comments were that in the case of sector-specific income taxes, it would be nice to have an idea of which sector is going to have lower participation relative to the no distortion case, and when we're looking at sector-independent income taxes, to understand what is the distinction between a model without endogenous sector choice, in which sales taxes is just about tailoring the final tax to the actual distribution within each sector, from a model that actually has sector choices. And finally, I think it would be nice to discuss a little bit what are the sufficient conditions in this environment in order to ensure monotonicity of the labor allocation rule. In the one-dimensional, so this is very standard in the literature. Most of the papers with optimal tax with multi-sectors do not discuss this in detail. I think in the one-dimensional case, we understand this very well. We know that when monotonicity cannot be ensured, we're going to have bunching, and we know under what conditions of the distribution we can ensure monotonicity. However, in this problem, this is more complicated. So first, it would be nice to know whether the monotonicity of the endogenous distribution over types at the optimal threshold level is sufficient to ensure monotonicity of the labor allocation rule. And second, what are the assumptions over the primitive distributions that allows us to say that the endogenous distribution is going to satisfy this monotone hazard rate condition, or whatever is the relevant condition that's necessary to ensure monotonicity. That'll be all. Thank you, Alessandro.
No? You want to say something?
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Actually, this work. Fantastic comments. I appreciate all of them. So maybe let me just maybe go back by one slide, if it is possible, so that I just use the list to reply. If it's not too difficult, otherwise I can say this minute. Okay. So. These are very, very pertinent issues, the one that Victor is pointing to. Let me start maybe from the bottom, moving up. How to guarantee monotonicity of labor allocation? That's a very good question, and that's needed for incentive compatibility. For some of the results, going back to what Umberto was also asking before, actually it's not quite my business. So that I start with something that is deemed to be incentive compatible, so it has to satisfy all this property, and I just envision a perturbation that preserve incentive compatibility. So optimality here is identified and not really working with primitives. So in that respect, I perfectly agree with Victor that the paper is not operationally useful to the sense of telling you exactly, in the end of the day, how to design the task code, because it doesn't tell you exactly what type of things guarantee the incentive compatibility that you want or not. It's just it's designed to uncover the suboptimality of the Diamond and Merlis environment. So you start with something that it better be incentive compatible. I envision a perturbation that preserves it does better. So unless your initial policy is such that it has embedded into it production efficiency, generically I can do better. But I agree that it would be nice to know more generally what primitive conditions do the job of guaranteeing monotonicity, which one they don't. You may need to do this reverse engineering of finding the primitive condition. I agree. Then sector-independent income taxes, so both of these examples that Victor considered are very illuminative, actually, and I definitely wanted to expand on in the paper based on the suggestion. The one where people are constrained to join one of the two sectors, and you're constrained to use uniform income taxes, and the only thing you can play with is sales taxes, is very interesting, but unfortunately doesn't permit you to establish the optimality of production efficiency. Simply because in this economy, the only way production efficiency could be established is by having people suboptimally being allocated to the different sectors. It's crucial for that they can endogenously sort for themselves between the two occupations. So actually, what you describe is what is Niato's paper. So Niato's paper, he highlighted that essentially, if people cannot really decide whether to become skilled or unskilled, then actually you may need to use sales taxes. You may also have distortions in how much of a how much of a work we provide within each sector, but this is not our definition of production efficiency. The other one, the other exercise you propose is very useful, the one with essentially, a degenerate sector. In one sector, you know exactly how productive agents are, and the other, you don't. That leads to this, very simple vertical cutoff function, and actually it's good. Actually, it highlights some of the key forces in a simplified manner, so I like it a lot. I'm going to, if you permit me, I'm going to exploit it in the paper. The other thing that you ask is properties of F that permit you to determine which sector will be favored. We tried a little bit of that, and we generically failed. I don't know if such a thing exists, but it fails within the set of things we tried. So that's my definition of genericity. So it's not scientific. It's very hard. Except in special cases where you can really tell what properties of the distribution of joint productivities induce the government to favor one sector over the other one. We tried, for example, the other rate order. We thought actually maybe that was the answer. It's not. This doesn't mean much. It simply points to the limitation of the authors. But I perfectly agree that it's a natural thing to ask. We couldn't find anything illuminated at the moment. That's why we didn't include it in the paper. But it's a very legitimate thing to